They say that history is written by the victors, but there are some chapters so steeped in darkness that ink refuses to dry upon the page, and memory itself recoils in horror, leaving only whispered legends to fill the void where the truth once stood. Welcome back, seekers of the obscure, to the Unveiled Scroll, where we peel back the layers of forgotten time to reveal the mysteries that lie beneath. So, please take a moment to strike that like button, subscribe to our Order of Historians, and ring the bell to ensure you never miss a descent into the unknown, because today we are opening the heavy iron gates of the Kingdom of Ethel to examine the tale of the obsidian clockmaker. It was the winter of 1704, a season recorded in the few surviving journals as the white silenced, when the snow fell not as soft flakes, but as heavy suffocating shrouds that buried the cobblestone streets of the capital in a tomb of ice. Yet it was not the cold that the citizens feared, but the rhythm that echoed from the high tower of the royal artificers guild, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to sync with the terrified pulse of the city itself. Our story centers on Elias Thorn, a man whose mind was a labyrinth of gears and springs, a genius whose intellect was only matched by a profound and melancholic sorrow that clung to him like a second skin. For Elias was not merely a clockmaker, he was a philosopher of time, obsessed with the notion that moments could be captured, stored, and replayed if only one possessed the correct vessel. The archives describe Thorn as a figure of tragic nobility, possessing eyes that seemed to look perpetually past the present moment into a future he was desperate to prevent. And his hands, stained with oil and brass filings, were said to move with a speed that defied the sluggish pace of human perception. King Alaric IV, a monarch whose vanity was as boundless as his empire, had commissioned Thorn to construct a marvel that would surpass all wonders of the known world, a clock not to tell the time, but to conquer it, for the king was aging, and the specter of mortality had begun to haunt his waking hours, turning his golden palace into a prison of paranoia. The commission was simple in its wording, yet impossible in its nature. Build me a machine that does not count the seconds passing, but arrests them, granting me an eternal noon where the sun never sets and my reign never ends. Thorn knew that to tamper with the flow of time was to invite a catastrophe of biblical proportions, yet he accepted the task not out of loyalty to the Mad King, but because he too had something he wished to save, a beloved daughter named Alara, who had fallen into a deep coma from a mysterious wasting sickness that the royal physicians could neither name nor cure. And so the pact was struck in the shadows of the throne room, a bargain that would doom them all, as Thorn retreated into his workshop, a cavernous hole filled with the ticking of 1,000 rejected prototypes, locking the doors against the world and delving into forbidden texts of alchemy and mechanics that had been banned by the church for centuries. The construction of the obsidian chronometer began under the veil of secrecy, but the city could feel its inception, for a strange heaviness settled over the air, as if the gravity itself was being warped by the density of the machine growing within the tower. Night after night, the citizens of Ethelgard would wake in a cold sweat, hearing not with their ears but with their very bones the grinding of gears that were too large to be made by human hands and too complex to be understood by human minds. It was during these long months that Thorn's sanity began to fray like an old rope stretched over a precipice, for he found that standard materials would not suffice to hold the paradox he was engineering, and he required something that could anchor the abstract concept of eternity into the physical realm. The journals of his apprentice, a young mute boy named Silas, which were found centuries later hidden in a hollowed-out wall, revealed the disturbing turn Thorn's experiments took as he began to whisper to the metal, believing that the brass and iron had a consciousness of their own, demanding a sacrifice greater than mere labor. The apprentice described his master standing before the colossal skeleton of the clock, which loomed like a dormant titan in the flickering candlelight, pleading with the mechanism to spare his daughter, even as he tightened the mainspring with a force that made the very foundations of the tower groan in protest. As the winter solstice approached, the deadline set by the king loomed like a guillotine blade in the atmosphere. In the capital grew manic with tension, for rumors had spread that the sun had actually begun to slow its descent across the sky, lingering unnaturally on the horizon as if afraid to dip below the edge of the world. On the eve of the unveiling, King Alaric, accompanied by his court of sycophants and doubters, ascended the spiraling stairs of the artificer's tower there, breath-forming clouds in the freezing air, their silks and velvets trailing on the dusty steps, unaware that they were walking into the belly of a beast that was hungry for something far more precious than gold. Thorn awaited them at the top, his appearance gaunt and wild, his hair white as the snow outside, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity that made even the king recoil, for the clockmaker had succeeded, but the price of his success was etched into the hollows of his face. The obsidian chronometer stood in the center of the chamber, a monstrosity of black metal and glass, its face not marked with numbers, but with strange shifting constellations that seemed to swirl like oil on water, and its pendulum did not swing back and forth, but rotated in a hypnotic, impossible circle that defied the laws of physics. "Your Majesty," Thorn whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment, "I present to you the engine of eternal noon, but I warn you that time is a river. And if you build a dam, the water must go somewhere, and the pressure will build until it shatters the world." The king, blinded by his fear of death, laughed at the warning, signaling his guards to seize the controls, for he desired to be the one to stop the sun. And with a trembling hand, Alaric reached out to engage the locking mechanism that would freeze the gears in place. The moment the king's skin touched the cold obsidian, a sound erupted, not a bang or a crash, but a sound like a collective gasp of the universe, as if the air was being sucked out of the room, and suddenly the candles were extinguished, plunging them into darkness save for the eerie violet glow emanating from the core of the machine. It was then that the screaming began, not from the courtiers, but from the walls themselves, as the stone began to weep a viscous, black fluid, and the shadows detached themselves from the corners of the room, taking on forms that were vaguely human, but elongated and twisted. Thorn rushed to his daughter's side, where she lay on a cot in the corner, hoping that the freezing of time would halt her sickness. But he watched in horror as she opened her eyes, which were now entirely black voids, reflecting the abyss of the machine. The king froze, not because the machine had worked as intended, but because he found he could not move his limbs, his body locked in a paralysis that was total and absolute, while his mind remained fully awake, trapped in a statue of living flesh. The courtiers tried to flee, but the door had vanished, replaced by a smooth wall of ticking gears. And they realized with dawning horror that they were no longer in the tower, but inside the clock itself. This was the first hour of the calamity, a period that would later be known as the fracture, where the boundaries between the physical world and the temporal void were erased, and the city of Ethelgard was pulled out of reality and into a pocket dimension of nightmare. Outside the tower, the citizens watched as the sky turned a bruised purple, and the snowflakes stopped in midair, suspended like stars in a firmament, while the silence returned heavier and more absolute than before. But inside the tower, the chaos was just beginning. Thorn realized that in his arrogance, he had not just stopped time. He had broken it, fracturing the linear progression of cause and effect, meaning that events were now happening out of order. The king was dying and being born and ruling and begging, all in the same flickering instant. The terror was not merely physical but existential, as the noblemen and women found themselves unmoored from the anchor of sequential existence, watching in mute horror as their reflections in the polished obsidian surfaces aged into dust and then bloomed back into youth in a sickening cycle of rapid decay and rebirth that tore at the fabric of their sanity. Thorn fought against the vertigo that threatened to claim him, grasping the railing of the dais with hands that felt simultaneously frail and strong, realizing that the machine was not just stopping time but devouring it, feeding on the potential futures of everyone trapped within the room to fuel the singularity it had created. He looked to Alara, expecting to see her frozen in the safety he had promised, but instead he saw her rising from the cot, her movements jerky and unnatural like a marionette, guided by an unseen puppeteer, and when she spoke, her voice was not the innocent timbre of a child but a chorus of whispering echoes that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a dead forest. "Father," she said, or rather the entity wearing her skin said, "you have given us the key, and now we shall feast on the moments you discarded," for it became clear too. Thorn in that heart-stopping realization that the obsidian chronometer was never a tool of preservation but a gateway for the chronophagia's entities from the void between seconds that hungered for the linear lives of mortals. The king, trapped in his living statue state, could only watch as the shadows detached themselves completely from the architecture and began to drape over his screaming courtiers, silencing them one by one, not by killing them but by erasing them from the narrative of the world, consuming their pasts, so that it was as if they had never been born at all, leaving only empty garments on the floor where vibrant, living souls had stood moments before. Thorn realized with a jolt of nausea that his bargain had been a lie from the start, fueled by his grief, and the whispers he had mistaken for inspiration were actually the seductive lures of these creatures waiting for a mind arrogant enough to build them a door Desperation clawed at his throat as he scrambled toward the controlled console, trying to reverse the polarity of the gears, but the metal burned his hands with a cold so intense it seared the flesh, for the machine was no longer obeying the laws of mechanics, but the laws of hunger. Outside the tower, the city of Ethelgard had fallen into a gray twilight where the wind did not blow and the birds hung motionless in the sky like ornaments on a painted canvas, and the people in the streets stood like wax figures caught in mid-step, their faces frozen in expressions of confusion and dawning fear. But inside the eye of the storm, the speed of events was accelerating into a blur of violet light and screaming metal as the chronophagy began to merge the timelines, causing the stone floor to ripple like water, revealing glimpses of the tower's past and its ruined future simultaneously. Thorn saw himself as a young man full of hope and ambition, and he saw his skeleton dusty and forgotten lying amidst the wreckage of the clock. And he understood that the trap was circular, a loop of suffering that would repeat for eternity unless he could shatter the cycle. He looked at the king, whose eyes were wide with a plea that his frozen lips could not form, and Thorn felt a surge of pity for the tyrant, who had only wanted to live forever, and had been granted his wish in the most cruel and twisted interpretation possible. The entity within Alara stepped closer, her feet not touching the ground, floating on a cushion of distorted gravity, and she reached out a hand that was translucent and shifting, essentially offering Thorn a place within the void, a chance to exist outside of pain, and lost to join them in the consumption of history. It was a tempting offer for a man whose heart had been broken by the cruel indifference of time, but as he looked into the void of her eyes, he saw a flicker of the real Eliara trapped deep within the prison of the entity, screaming silently for her father to save her. That singular spark of humanity ignited a fire in Thorn's soul that burned hotter than the cold logic of his intellect, and he grabbed a heavy wrench from his belt, not to fix the machine, but to destroy the delicate escapement mechanism that regulated the flow of the paradox. He swung with all the strength of a desperate father, but the air itself turned to syrup, slowing his arm to a crawl, as the entity laughed, a sound like grinding glass mocking his futile resistance against the inevitable. "You cannot break what is already broken," the voice chorused, filling his mind with visions of a world consumed by the gray stasis where Ethelgard would become a monument to the end of time, a museum of the dead preserved in amber for the amusement of gods. But Thorn was a clockmaker, and he knew that every machine, no matter how complex, had a flaw, a pressure point where the stress was greatest, and he realized that the machine was drawing its power from the king's fear, amplifying it through the obsidian lenses to sustain the rift. If he could not break the machine, he had to remove the fuel source, which meant he had to reach Alaric, who was standing at the epicenter of the temporal storm, protected by a barrier of solidified time. Thorn pushed himself forward, fighting against the currents of temporal wind that tried to age him into dust, forcing his will. Against the overwhelming pressure of the chronophages, his skin cracking and healing in rapid succession as he traversed the few yards that felt like miles. He shouted to the king, trying to break through the paralysis of terror, begging Alaric to let go of his fear, to accept the inevitability of death, for only by accepting the end could the cycle be broken. It was a theological paradox, screamed into the face of a cosmic horror, for the king had spent his life running from the grave, and now he had to embrace it to save his kingdom. Alaric's eyes darted frantically, locked on Thorn's approaching figure, and for a moment the king's vanity warred with a survival instinct. But as he saw the entities consuming the last of his advisors, erasing their names from the royal lineage, leaving blanks in the family trees, he understood the magnitude of his folly. The king closed his eyes, surrendering his desire for eternity, and in that moment of acceptance the violet light faltered. The hum of the machine hitching as the fuel of pure terror was cut off. The barrier weakened just enough for Thorn to swing his wrench not at the gears, but at the primary crystal lens that focused the energy onto the king, a desperate gamble that would either free them or detonate the tower like a bomb. The impact was silent at first, a spiderweb of cracks appearing on the obsidian surface, spreading with agonizing slowness, before the crystal exploded outward with a force that threw Thorn back against the far wall, shrapnel of black glass, embedding itself in the stone and in his flesh. The sound returned with a vengeance, a roar of rushing air, as time rushed back into the vacuum, violent and uncontrolled, slamming into reality with the force of a tidal wave, causing the tower to shudder and crack. The entity within Alara shrieked a sound of pure frustration as it was pulled back toward the rift, its grip on the girl's form loosening as the connection to the void was severed. But the damage had been done, for the explosion had not just stopped the machine, it had the foundation of the tower, and the very ground beneath Ethelgard began to groan as the timeline tried to snap back into place, violently correcting the intrusion. Thorn, bleeding and broken, crawled toward the unconscious form of his daughter, shielding her body with his own as the ceiling began to collapse, raining debris and dust upon the cursed laboratory. The collapse of the Artificer's Tower was not recorded in the seismographs of neighboring kingdoms as a typical earthquake, for the vibrations were not of the earth, but of the ether, creating a silent implosion that swallowed the structure whole, pulling it down into the scarred earth as if the ground itself was recoiling from the abomination it had hosted. When the dust finally settled and the violet hue faded from the sky, the survivors of Ethelgard emerged from their homes into a world that felt fundamentally altered, a place where the sun seemed to shine with a slightly dimmer light, and the shadows stretched just a little too long for the time of day. Rescue efforts were mounted immediately by the bewildered city guard, who dug through the rubble of the tower, hoping to find the king, or at least his body, but all they found were gears fused with stone and shards of obsidian that hummed with a faint, headache-inducing frequency. Miraculously, amidst the wreckage, they found Elias Thorn huddled in a pocket of space beneath a fallen archway, clutching his daughter Alara, who was breathing but catatonic, her eyes wide and staring at something no one else could see. The king, however, was gone, vanished without a trace, along with his entire retinue, leaving behind only the rumors that would later curdle into the ghost stories that plague the region to this day, stories that claim Alaric was not killed but was pulled into the clock itself, destined to become a cog in the machine he sought to command, living out his eternal noon in a prison of his own making. In the weeks that followed the incident, which historians now refer to as the fracture of 1704, the city of Eth began to exhibit symptoms of a metaphysical sickness that defied medical explanation. It started with small things. Clocks in the city would never keep the same time, often running backwards, or stopping altogether for hours before racing forward to catch up. And milk would sour in the adder within minutes, while bread left on the counter would remain fresh, for years refusing to mold. But the true horror lay in the condition known as the temporal stutter, which afflicted those who had been closest to the tower when the chronometer detonated. These poor souls found themselves unstuck in the flow of the present, intermittently flickering out of existence for seconds or minutes at a time, only to reappear in the exact same spot, unaware that any time had passed, while for the observer they had simply vanished into thin air. Thorn himself became a recluse, locking himself away in a modest cottage on the edge of the city, tending to Alara, who had stopped aging, entirely remaining a girl of 12 for the next 40 years, a living testament to the time that had been stolen. The journals recovered from this period paint a picture of a city slowly going mad, isolated from the rest of the world by a superstitious fear that the curse was contagious, leading trade routes to be diverted and travelers to give the valley a wide berth. Thorn spent his remaining years not in the pursuit of mechanics, but in a desperate attempt to atone, writing feverish treatises on the nature of chronological ethics, warning future generations that time is not a resource to be mined, but a sacred river that must flow unimpeded. He wrote of the voices he still heard in the silence of the night, the whispering of the chronophosias, scratching at the thin veil of reality, waiting for another crack to appear, and he suspected that the explosion had not killed them but merely pushed them back, leaving a scar on the world that remained tender and easily opened. The most disturbing account comes from the local priest, Father Thomas, who visited Thorn on his deathbed decades later and recorded the clockmaker's final confession, a rambling monologue in which Thorn claimed that he had not destroyed the machine to save the city, but to save the timeline itself, because he had seen a vision of the future where the machine had been allowed to run. In that alternate future, the obsidian chronometer had expanded its field until it covered the entire globe, freezing all of humanity in a perfect agonizing moment of eternal preservation, a museum of statues, trapped in a single heartbeat, forever conscious, but unable to move or die. Thorn died with a look of terrified ambiguity on his face, unsure if his sacrifice had been enough, or if he had simply delayed the inevitable. And with his death, the last person who truly understood the mechanics of the curse was gone, leaving Ethelgard to rot in its own stagnant mystery. As the years turned into decades, the city withered, the population dwindling as the young fled the oppressive atmosphere, leaving behind a ghost town populated by the elderly and the stuttering afflicted, who wandered the streets like fading in and out of view. The ruins of the tower remained a forbidden zone, a jagged scar in the center of the city where the laws of physics were merely suggestions, and where on quiet nights one could still hear the rhythmic grinding of gears beneath the earth, as if the heart of the machine was still beating, waiting for a hand to wind it once more. It was during the Victorian era that a team of occult investigators from the Royal Society arrived in the ruins, drawn by the legends of the time distortion, bringing with them early photographic equipment and devices to measure magnetic fields, hoping to debunk the myths of the backward village. Their findings, however, were sealed by the Crown immediately upon their return to London, and the lead investigator, Dr. Arthur Pendleton, was committed to an asylum shortly after raving about the faces he had seen trapped in the photographic plates, faces of men in archaic court dress screaming silently from within the emulsion of the film. The only surviving evidence from their expedition is a single daguerreotype image that surfaced at an auction in 1999, appearing to show the ruins of the tower, but superimposed over the rubble is a faint ghostly image of the intact clock, a towering monolith of black metal standing tall against a sky that looks like shattered glass. This image suggests that the tower exists in a state of quantum superposition, both destroyed and whole, simultaneously occupying the same space but separated by a frequency that the human eye cannot perceive. The tragedy of Ethelgod serves as a grim reminder of the hubris of man, the belief that we can conquer the fundamental forces of the universe without paying a toll in blood and soul. But the story does not end with the death of the city, for the legacy of the obsidian clockmaker had a way of resurfacing in the most unexpected places, carrying the infection of the fractured time into the modern era. The unsettling legacy of Elias Thorne did not fade into mere legend, but instead seeped into the collective unconscious, manifesting subtly throughout the next 2 centuries, a creeping technological haunting that suggested the chronometer had not been destroyed, but its chaotic energy dispersed across the globe. We see echoes of Ethelgod in the later Industrial Revolution, where the sudden unexplained stoppages of massive factory clocks and the bizarre temporal anomalies reported in newly established power stations suggested that the chronophagus was still feeding on the margins of human progress. There is a particularly chilling declassified military report from the 1940s, detailing an experiment gone wrong in a secluded physics lab, where a newly developed oscillator, designed to measure microtime, exploded, leaving behind a residue of black crystalline dust identical to the material Thorne used on his central mechanism. The 2 scientists involved were found completely preserved, like mummies in their chairs, their skin taut and their eyes open and staring, but the autopsy revealed that every single internal organ had aged rapidly into dust, horrifying reversal of the clockmaker's intention. The authorities quickly covered up the incident, claiming it was an accident involving volatile chemicals, but the lead investigator mysteriously suffered from the temporal stutter, for the rest of his life flickering in and out of his reality, until he finally vanished, entirely in a busy train station, never to return. The most compelling modern evidence, however, lies in the digital age, where the very concept of time is regulated by atomic precision and transmitted through global networks. Computer scientists occasionally report what they call ghost loops in certain outdated codebases, particularly those governing ancient banking or archival systems where data will spontaneously corrupt, then heal itself, presenting a paradox that defies the logic of programming, an echo, perhaps, of the fracturing of cause and effect that occurred in the Artificer's Tower. Furthermore, the persistent urban legend of the missing hour that permeates the internet speaks of an hour of daylight that is collectively forgotten by millions of people simultaneously, a moment when global timekeeping seems to hiccup, leaving a blank space in the 24-hour cycle. Though usually attributed to mundane causes like daylight savings adjustment or mass hysteria, those who study the Ethelgard incident wonder if this is the chronometer drawing breath once more, momentarily opening the rift to siphon off energy before the world corrects itself. The ultimate fate of Alara Thorne remains one of the darkest mysteries, for she outlived her father by decades, still trapped in the body of a 12-year-old girl, eventually ending up in a state-run institution near the Swiss Alps. Reports from the nurses who cared for her describe a patient who never spoke, who never aged, and whose presence was oddly oppressive, often causing the clocks in her room to melt, or her caregivers to experience intense temporal disorientation, feeling as though hours had passed in mere minutes. After her death, which occurred in 1915 at the chronological age of 123, her body was immediately sent for specialized study, but the shipment was intercepted by an unknown party and her remains disappeared completely, leaving only a single cryptic note in the sealed crate, which read simply, "The key is home." It is believed by some fringe historians that the obsidian chronometer was not just a machine, but a focal point, a prison for the king, and a gateway for the chronophagus, and that the king's despair and Thorne's paternal grief acted as the binding agents that fused the human element with the cosmic horror. King Alaric may still be in that pocket of shattered time, ruling his eternal noon, a monarch of a single moment, perpetually experiencing his own death and the destruction of his kingdom over and over, a nightmare, far worse than any simple expiration. The kingdom of Ethelgard remains marked on modern maps, not as a thriving metropolis, but as the silent fields ad desolatere, where the atmosphere is thick and the air itself feels cold, even in the height of summer. A permanent chill left. By the time that was arrested, so we are left with a terrifying proposition: was the clockmaker a tragic hero who saved the world from eternal stasis? Or was he the arrogant villain, whose genius merely infected the future with a slow-acting temporal poison that continues to eat away at the margins of our reality? The answer lies buried beneath the rubble and the shifting sands of time, a chilling reminder that some doors in the universe are locked for a reason, and that man's desire to conquer the limitations of his own mortality often leads not to eternal life, but to eternal damnation. The shadows lengthen and the clock ticks relentlessly on, but remember that in the vast expanse of history there are moments that refuse to be forgotten, and names like Elias Thorne and Ethelgard whispered not as cautionary tales, but as evidence that the past is never truly past. That is all the time we have for today. Seekers of the Scroll, do not forget to tell us in the comments what ancient curse or forgotten kingdom we should delve into next, and remember to check out our other deep dives into the esoteric corners of history. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your clocks running true.